Hi, I'm James Verdier, and welcome to the American Institute of Biological Sciences BioScience Talks, which is a forum for integrating the life sciences. On the second Wednesday of each month, we discuss the latest bioscience publications. And as a reminder, if you'd like to read more, point your browser to bioscience.oxfordjournals.org. Before we get into today's show, I wanted to take just a moment to tell you about a new AIBS program, which is our Communications Training Bootcamp for Scientists. It's an intensive 2-day program in Washington, D.C. that will help participants translate scientific findings for non-technical audiences, as well as learn how to engage with media and decision makers. The idea is to help ensure that policy is informed by good science. And if you'd like to learn more, go to io.aibs.org/bootcamp. And for today's episode, I'm joined by Vicki Martin, who has just completed a PhD in citizen science and science communication at Southern Cross University in Lismore, Australia. She's here to talk to us about a large-scale study on public interest in marine citizen science. Now, we've talked about citizen science on the show in the past, but this conversation gave us a chance to look much more deeply at some of the issues involved, those relating to public attitudes, study design, and the potential for growth in the field. So let's get straight to that interview. Vicki, thank you very much for being on the show today.
Oh, thanks very much for having me, James.
Before we get too deeply into the topic and about your article, I was hoping that we could set up a working definition of citizen science, just so that we're all on the same page there. So could you describe briefly, what is citizen science and, why have we been hearing about it so much recently?
Oh, well, there's lots of different definitions being thrown around, but for me, it's simply research that involves the public in the scientific process in some aspects. So the most common citizen science projects tend to be ones where the public are assisting with data collection or maybe data analysis. And we're seeing the trend worldwide partly driven by the ability of technology to connect public members of the public with scientists and scientific research. So that's greatly enabled by all these amazing apps on our smartphones and that sort of thing. But there's also a push from many governments who have seen, particularly in Australia, US and in Europe, to drive citizen science for the benefit of the relationship between science and society. So we're seeing a lot of funding being put into citizen science projects around the globe.
Great. Now, I was hoping you could talk just a little bit about one of your findings, which was that those who were most likely to participate in marine citizen science were also those who knew the most about science and were already the most interested in science. Can you tell us a little bit more about that group?
Yes, that was something that was very clear. I mean, it's a difficult thing to study people who are disinterested in citizen science when you're sending out a survey about participation in research. But we were able to get enough people in this much smaller subgroup in the survey who are disinterested, and they tend to not have not be as highly educated. They're certainly not interested in science and not highly educated in science either. So we can't draw any very definite conclusions, but it's given us some insights into the types of people who are willing to assist marine research anyway. And they do tend to have higher levels of education. And I think the really surprising thing from the survey results was that remembering that this is more of a description of the types of people who are interested in research, was that about half of them were highly educated, so they've had tertiary or higher education, and many of those have tertiary education in science as well. But about half of those people with the tertiary education in science are not actually working in the science industry. So this makes me think, well, maybe those people see citizen science opportunities as a way to keep up their skills in science, or maybe make the best use of their training in science, even though they're not working as scientists.
Oh, so you have people who, have a strongly scientific background, but are not in a position for whatever reason to put those skills to work professionally, and perhaps that's driving their interest in citizen science.
Yeah, and that brings up a whole lot of other questions which would spur more research. But
before we get too deeply into the results of the survey, Could you describe a little bit the structure and the scope of that survey, and sort of what you were hoping to learn from it? What were its objectives?
Sure. Well, I really wanted to find out three things. So if, why, and how the public want to get involved in marine research. And this is largely because we see the push for more citizen science in Australia, but also because our National Science Engagement Strategy states that marine science could present lots of great opportunities to connect more Australians with science in general. So I really wanted to take a national approach to this research, and it started by conducting 110 face-to-face interviews with marine users, and this was in 4 very distinct regions of Australia. So that's when we on the ground talking to people at boat ramps and fishing spots and divers and yacht clubs and all sorts of people. And that really helped to inform the questions for the national survey. So the second phase was this national survey, which was delivered online, and that saw 145 fully completed responses from marine users all over Australia. So we managed to get responses from every single state and mainland territory of Australia. So that was really great.
Just one question on those face-to-face interviews. How are you recruiting those people? Were you simply going out to the fishing spots and the dive spots and asking people if they were willing to participate?
Yes, that's the way I did it. I really wanted to talk to people that perhaps wouldn't otherwise respond to an online survey, just to get a really broad sample. So I was being a bit selective, trying to make sure that I got a good range of ages and different interests. And sometimes it was a little challenging because I wasn't sure about approaching some people, but usually in those situations, it ended up being the most amazing conversations that I had out of the whole project. So it was well worth doing, and that's what I've tended to do in the past in my previous research roles.
That's fascinating. And how did you recruit the people for the online survey?
Yeah, well, that was a great challenge. Anyone who knows about conducting national surveys knows that they can be very expensive. So the approach I took, being a student with a very limited budget, was during the interviews I asked people about how they were connected online and that sort of thing, knowing that I was going to conduct an online survey. And I also asked them about what it would take to get them to fill in an online survey that would take about half an hour on that same topic. So it was very clear that the marine users in my target audience were highly connected on Facebook, much more so than I anticipated, and that they were really keen on prizes. So I managed to gather up some sponsors who donated some prizes for a prize draw, and then set up a Facebook account with information about the research to help share and promote. But Facebook wasn't the only method. We also sent out media releases. In addition to that, I sent out 60 tailored media releases to individual coastal newspapers. We contacted marine-related magazines and online forums everywhere, fishing forums, kayaking forums. I had a really substantial email list to contact Sea Scouts and surf lifesavers, all sorts of different interest groups around the country. It was absolutely massive. But Facebook was really useful. So I ended up having amazing conversations via Facebook with everyone from crayfish deckhands on the other side of the country to commercial fishermen, divers all over the country. It was a really useful platform for this type of research.
And what did you find from it? The people you were talking to were, for the most part, heavy marine users in one way or another. How did you divide those groups up?
Well, I asked them about all of the activities that they participate in the marine environment, just to get an idea of, the types of activities that these people like to do. And then I asked them, out of all of those activities, which one do they prefer the most? So which one do they identify with? And that enabled me to group them into three key groups. So there were divers and recreational fishers, and then everyone else got grouped into the final group I just called other, so other marine users. And that enabled some really useful comparisons for the type of citizen science projects that I had in mind.
And so were these by and large people who had participated in any citizen science projects in the past or had not?
Well, in the study, in the survey, I presented a hypothetical marine citizen science project to them because I wanted to drill down into trying to uncover some of the barriers and the drivers for participation in marine citizen science, and that really required a case study approach. So for that, I asked them whether they had submitted any photographs of marine species to a citizen science project in the past, and only about a fifth of the respondents had. I actually suspected that it might have been higher than that, mainly because people who participate in citizen science already are more likely to answer the survey than not.
And so you'd had about a fifth or 20% had participated in citizen science before. Could you tell us a little more about the hypothetical citizen science project that you discussed with them in the survey? What kind of thing were you asking them about?
So I modelled it on one of the only national citizen science projects in the marine environment in Australia, and that's called REDMAP. People can find out information about it by Googling REDMAP Australia. Now, REDMAP asks people to submit sightings of uncommon marine species in a particular area. And what they're trying to do is determine which species are shifting or extending their normal range due to changes in the marine environment, such as the warming currents that we've got moving polewards, so south for us, down under. And so certainly in some of the interview work I did, I was talking to fishers in particular in southern Australia are starting to see some of the more northern species moving into their areas. So for some of them, this is a fantastic thing because they're suddenly catching prize fish that they used to have to travel for. So what I did in the national survey was set up this situation or scenario where there's a hypothetical project asking for contributions of photographs of uncommon marine species for a particular area. And I really wanted to know whether people were willing to submit photographs to science for this sort of project, what some of the barriers were in particular, what some of the outcomes were that they anticipated from participation. And that enabled me to also look at what their past experience was. Have they contributed to that sort of, I call it opportunistic citizen science. So it's basically where people see a marine species, take a photograph of it and submit it to a scientific database of some sort.
And what did you find? What was the general marine user's willingness to participate in a project of that sort?
Well, it was so I had some general questions as well. So generally, people were really willing to contribute to marine research of any sort, not necessarily the hypothetical project. So to start with, the number of hours that they were willing to donate to scientific research was actually much higher than I anticipated, and because there were not a lot of the majority had not contributed to this type of marine research before, it really showed that there's quite a vast untapped, or as yet untapped, pool of volunteers who are willing to participate in research. Now, there were some caveats. Some people were, would you say, more mildly interested rather than really highly enthusiastic. But generally there are a lot of people who are willing to give up at least a day a month to assist in marine research. So that's really good news for the direction that marine citizen science is heading. That's great news. So that's a full day of work a month. Yeah. There was a fairly significant group that expressed that, and half of the divers were willing to volunteer at least once a month, and over half of all the respondents were willing to volunteer at least 7 days a year. So that's a week's worth of fieldwork per person. Yeah, I mean, that strikes me as an enormous potential resource for researchers. Yeah. And by and large, I would imagine untapped, because only 20% of the sample has previously participated in a citizen science project. Yeah, so that's not all citizen science. It was only the photographic type citizen science where they're submitting photographs of marine species. So they may have assisted in other types of projects, but essentially due to the space limits, I wasn't able to explore other areas that they'd maybe contributed to. Okay, so it sounds as though there's this large population of people who are spending time participating and using the marine environment, and they are highly educated, at least many of them, about science in general and marine science in particular, and they're willing to be put to work. So, what's the next step? How can they be further engaged in this type of project? Well, and that's why I really wanted to understand what some of the barriers and the drivers are for participation. So not reported in this particular article, but in another analysis of some further survey questions, we determined that one of the main barriers for people is their assumption that they don't have enough knowledge about marine species to participate in a project like the hypothetical one. So, from my perspective, communication, or effective communication, is really driven by really good quality audience research, and this is something that we need to do much better, but much more often as well. So I see a lot of citizen science projects being set up without a lot of audience research being conducted. But that once we know what the audience's interests and communication needs are, we can tailor projects to fit those needs much better and be much more effective with our engagement. So we want to ensure that recruitment, but also volunteer retention, is really high. And retention is one of the most challenging aspects of running a citizen science project. So I really see that we have to be a bit more audience-driven in our approach to a lot of citizen science, and that's really for the glaringly obvious statement I'm about to make, that right. There's no citizen science without the public. So there's no point in setting up citizen science projects that people are not interested in. And in fact, I had one marine scientist say to me, "Oh, but I've tried citizen science and no one turned up." And that just really emphasises that point, that we need to do better audience research. Right. And, one of the terms that jumped out at me in the article was you mentioned deliberate design and sort of tailoring the project not only to the research need, but also to, those who you hope to enlist. And how does that manifest itself? How is that research best effective? I guess, yeah. So the research that I've conducted for this article gives a bit of an overview of general interest in marine citizen science, but then it's that each project will need to do their own audience research because it's context specific. Each audience will have very different needs, and we saw that in some of the questions that I asked, such as the preferred roles that they'd like to play in research. Now, across the board, all groups were most interested in data collection, but their second preferences vary greatly. So fishers were more interested in helping decide the research topics. Divers preferred to help analyse the findings, and that probably goes hand in hand with the divers having a much higher scientific training than any other group. So they probably feel more comfortable in analysing the findings. And the other marine users said they preferred to help communicate the findings. So we see that there's some very large differences between groups. Now, there's various ways in social research to go about some audience research, but my recommendation would be really to take a subsample of your target audience and really try and drill down into some of the burning questions that you'll have about engagement. So what sort of roles are they interested in? How much time? How do they want to engage? Feedback, we know now, is extremely important. And it's an often neglected area in many projects. The people who are contributing, they want to see that their efforts are being taken somewhere and are being used. So I took that to heart with this project as well. So I maintain the Facebook page to feedback the results to everyone, and also an email list to everyone who participated in the survey, so that I can send the results back out to the community as well.
And you mentioned earlier, the troubles with retention. It was a lack of feedback one of the things that fed into that?
Yeah, this came up a number of times in the face-to-face interviews, that people had said that they've assisted either marine research or marine management in the past, and then hadn't seen any outcomes from that assistance, and a lot of people expressed this sense of being burned by the process. So I think this is really important to keep in mind, that these citizen science projects are nothing without the volunteers. So we have to make sure that part of the very nature of the project is that feedback process. It doesn't end at data collection for the citizens. So I think that is key. And as I mentioned, volunteer retention is a significant challenge in citizen science. We're starting to see some data coming out in that, and this is a question that I'd like to explore in further research at some point. So trying to work out which factors are really important for retaining volunteers in the long term.
Okay, so just thinking about it from the practitioner's perspective, it seems like the most important things are to first do your audience research, so to know something about the people you're hoping to recruit,
mm-hmm.
and what sort of tasks that they are eager to do, and then after that to make sure that you have an open line of communication with them, and so that they get an actual sense that the work that they've performed has been useful scientifically.
Yes, yeah. We also found that a lot of volunteers are really eager to learn a lot more about the marine environment. And given that one of the barriers that we detected was this assumption that they didn't have enough knowledge about marine species to be able to participate, we really see that creating opportunities for people to learn more is a really important part of marine citizen science in this context anyway. So providing some extra opportunities, and the other thing is to really acknowledge some of the important skills and knowledge that the volunteers have. I know not all scientists think this at all, but some of the scientists I've spoken to assume that the public don't have the skills or the training to really contribute to robust scientific research. Yet, if they're trained at the higher education levels in science, there's no reason to think that they can't contribute to research in really reliable ways. So I think, it all goes back to understanding the audience too, but I think really there's the potential to make the most out of the volunteers' skills and knowledge to really push the project in all sorts of ways in the future.
And speaking of that, that level of capability that some participants have, what does that look like? You mentioned earlier among the divers a propensity for or desire to do analysis. And I was hoping you could give us just an example of that if one comes to mind, because, whenever I've thought about or looked at citizen science projects in the past, it's always been in the context of a really basic data collection, whether that's taking a water sample from one place or another, or taking a photograph or something like that. But, what is that analytical portion? What can that look like?
Well, I guess the example that springs to mind most readily is actually ones like Galaxy Zoo, which is not marine related at all, but rather the opposite. Galaxy Zoo asks people to help classify images of galaxies, so that it greatly enables the processing of millions of images. Now, Galaxy Zoos managed to recruit volunteers from all over the world, just hundreds of thousands of them. It's been incredibly successful. At a much smaller scale, but marine related, we had a project here in Australia called Explore the Sea Floor. Now, they asked people to help process images of kelp and sea urchins. So a lot of school students got involved with that as well. So basically it was assessing the percentage of sea urchins and kelp on the seafloor through actually I'm not quite sure how many thousands of images, a lot of images anyway.
Right.
And, they had to identify when a dot was on top of a piece of kelp or an urchin. So that's one way, but I suspect there's actually potential for a lot more in terms of actually getting people involved in more of the statistics. If that's their training and that's their passion, there's no reason that for members or volunteers not to get involved if they're willing to work with the scientists on those sorts of aspects. There's talk of it from what I've detected. There may be projects out there that once they see that volunteers have certain specialties, they perhaps bring them on board as part of the team. But I'm not too familiar with some of the finer details of projects around the country. But yeah, there's certainly great potential there too.
And this may be, this question may have an Australia-specific answer, but I'm curious because it often comes up. But do you have any advice for people who may want to become involved in citizen science? Those of our listeners out there, who, whether it be in a marine environment or not, are eager to do some citizen science. They want to collect some data. They want to do some basic analysis. They want to put those, scientific skills that they may have developed at one point or another to use. Where should they start?
There are a lot of online resources for people around the globe to look up different citizen science projects wherever you are. There's some that are very specific to the US. We've got some in Australia which are being added to all the time, and the database is still being developed. So there's plenty of resources, and Google searches will point you in the right direction. But the US, Europe, and Australia all have citizen science associations. So if you look up your country-specific association, you'll find a lot more information on their websites as well.
Great, and we'll make sure that we include some in the show notes as well, so that anyone who's eager to get out there and to do some citizen science is able to. One last question, which is, what's next for you in your research? What are you hoping to look at next?
Well, I'm currently waiting for my PhD to be examined, but what's next? I'm hoping will be a postdoc to pursue more of my interests in creating, or how to create better connections between science and society. And this is most likely going to be through more research into citizen science. And there's certainly plenty of scope for social research in this area, and it's quite an exciting field to be working in.
Great, and that seems like a great place to leave it. Vicki, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you, James.
And that concludes this episode of BioScience Talks. Just a reminder, the journal BioScience is published by Oxford University Press on behalf of the American Institute of Biological Sciences and is made possible by the support of our members and donors. Thank you, and talk to you next time.